The Silent Strategist, the story of Hannah Morrison. Toward the horizon of Columbia, a legacy was unfolding. Hannah Morrison entered the world in 1820 on the Witmore estate, situated roughly 15 miles northwest of Charleston along the banks of the Ashley River. Her mother, Celia, held the role of head cook for the manor house, a designation that offered a unique blend of internal influence and extreme peril. Being the head cook meant being privy to the most intimate household secrets, managing the entire food supply, and possessing keys to every chamber in the residence. However, it also meant bearing the immediate brunt of the master's rage whenever a meal failed to meet his exacting standards. While Hannah's paternity was never formally declared, it was an open secret across the fields that she was the daughter of Thomas Witmore himself. This lineage branded Hannah with the cruel label of house slave. Her skin was pale enough to permit her labor indoors, yet never pale enough to grant her the right to be free. This mixed ancestry was simultaneously her most powerful tool and her most profound agony. From a young age, Hannah displayed a startling intellect that both amazed and frightened her fellow bondsmen. While other children her age occupied themselves in the dust between the cabins, Hannah would retreat into quiet corners, absorbing dialogues she was never intended to hear. Her memory was nothing short of miraculous. She could recount complex conversations verbatim days after they occurred, and she never once forgot a face, a specific name, or a perceived insult. Celia recognized her daughter's intellectual capacity early on. "Listen, child," she would murmur as they toiled together over the hearth. "You possess a mind keener than any blade in this kitchen, but sharp objects can cut in two directions. Misuse that mind, and it will be your undoing. Use it with purpose, and perhaps, just perhaps, it will be the undoing of them." The Witmore kitchen served as Hannah's primary academy. Constructed as a detached structure behind the manor to mitigate fire risks, it functioned as a sovereign world. A massive hearth dominated one side, fitted with iron hooks for heavy pots and a sophisticated array of cranes for shifting boiling kettles. The walls were lined with shelves holding ceramic jars filled with aromatic spices, desiccated herbs, and preserved provisions. At the center sat an enormous wooden block, scarred by years of heavy blade work. It was within these walls that Celia instructed Hannah in the twin arts of culinary skill and survival. "Every seedling has a destiny," Celia would remark, while pulverizing flora with her mortar and pestle. "Some serve to mend, some to injure, and some to end life. A cook who masters the properties of plants wields more genuine authority than any overseer with a lash." Hannah learned to distinguish every species of plant on the estate. She discovered that willow bark offered a remedy for pain, that foxglove could regulate a frantic pulse, and that castor beans were capable of inducing violent sickness. Most critically, she was introduced to the oleander, a striking flowering shrub that flourished wildly throughout the South Carolina landscape. "Every segment of the oleander is a deadly toxin," Celia explained. "Yet it remains almost impossible to trace in a dish if handled with precision." "Why are you showing me these things, Mama?" a 12-year-old Hannah inquired one afternoon, watching her mother isolate dangerous stalks from edible herbs. Celia cast a glance toward the main residence, where the muffled shouts of Master Witmore directed at a field hand reached their ears. "Because wisdom is the solitary thing they cannot strip from you, daughter. They can trade your flesh and attempt to crush your soul, but they cannot reach what remains in your mind. And occasionally what sits in your mind is the only blade you have left to wield." Hannah's upbringing was defined by the relentless cruelty inherent to enslaved life. She witnessed companions sold into the void without a moment's notice. She saw men flogged until they lost the ability to stand, women mistreated by overseers, and children driven to labor until they collapsed from sheer fatigue. However, a singular event when she reached the age of 14 would redefine her entire existence. On a humid, suffocating August morning in 1834, Hannah's younger brother, Moses, only 10 years old, was apprehended taking a single peach from the Witmore grove. He had gone without food for 2 full days. The rations for the enslaved had been slashed because the cotton yield had fallen short of expectations. The boy was simply starving. Thomas Witmore decided to transform Moses into a grim warning. He commanded all the enslaved people to assemble in the courtyard to observe the penalty for theft. Hannah stood paralyzed as her young brother was secured to the whipping post. The initial stroke of the lash shredded his thin shirt. The second drew blood. By the fifth strike, Moses's cries had ceased. He hung limply against his restraints. "I beg you, master," Celia cried out, stepping forward from the crowd. "He is but a child. He was only hungry." Witmore directed his frigid, slate-grey gaze toward Celia. "Hungry, is he? Then let us provide him with a true reason for lamentation." He signaled to the overseer, who resumed the assault. 20 lashes later, Moses hung in a state of unconsciousness. Hannah tracked every single strike, searing the tally into her soul. 20 lashes for a 10-year-old boy who sought a peach to survive. After the crowd faded, Hannah assisted her mother in carrying Moses back to their quarters. He survived the ordeal, but he was fundamentally altered. His spirit had been shattered alongside several of his ribs. That night, as Hannah applied dampened cloths to her brother's lacerations, a tectonic shift occurred within her. The terror that had long resided in her heart crystallized into something else, a cold, methodical hatred that would burn with the steady intensity of a candle flame for the next 13 years. "Mama," she whispered into the midnight air, "tell me more about the plants. Tell me everything." From that evening forward, Hannah's schooling adopted a more shadows-driven objective. During her dawn walks to gather kitchen herbs, she began collecting alternative specimens. She discovered that moonflower seeds could induce madness, that pokeweed berries could halt the breath, and that deathcap mushrooms, while mimicking edible varieties, could destroy the liver within a matter of days. She initiated experiments on vermin first, then on ailing poultry destined for the axe. She studied the nuances of concentration, the importance of timing, and the specific physiological responses to various toxins. Above all, she mastered the art of discretion. A proficient poisoner, she realized, ensured that death appeared to be the result of misfortune or natural decay. As Hannah matured, her role in the household transitioned. By 16, she had become her mother's lead assistant, taking charge of breakfast and midday meals, while Celia focused on the more complex dinner services. This gave Hannah unparalleled insight into the Witmore family's internal rhythms. She noted that Thomas Witmore demanded his coffee black with exactly 2 measures of sugar at precisely 7 a.m. Elenina Witmore favored tea with honey and toast with bitter marmalade. James Witmore, now 22 and inheriting his father's malice, required his eggs over easy and his bacon scorched. She memorized their timelines, their idiosyncratic habits, their tastes and their vulnerabilities. Hannah also began weaving connections with enslaved people on neighboring estates. The communication network between plantations was remarkably advanced. Laborers moving between lands, domestic servants attending social functions with their masters, and free black artisans in Charleston all served as couriers of information. Through this web, Hannah realized the atrocities she endured were not isolated to the Witmore grounds. She heard of masters who drove their people into the earth, of families torn asunder and scattered to distant states, and of systemic abandonment. She heard of grand galas thrown by owners while their laborers survived on offal. But she also heard the quiet murmurs of defiance. She learned of those who had vanished via the Underground Railroad, of subtle acts of equipment sabotage, and of strategic work slowdowns. Most fascinatingly, she heard whispers of other domestic workers who had taken more permanent measures against exceptionally sadistic masters. There was a cook in the Virginia Territory, an elder field hand named Samuel recounted during a rare visit to the cabins. Her name was Martha. Her master used to punish folk with a glowing iron poker. One afternoon, Martha added a special seasoning to his pottage. They discovered him 3 days later, stiff as a timber. The physician claimed it was a heart ailment, but Martha knew the truth. "Bah, what became of Martha?" Hannah inquired. Samuel shrugged. "Nothing. No one ever suspected the cook. The master's brother took over the land and treated the people with far more humanity. Occasionally, the spirit works in ways we cannot see." Bar these accounts sowed the seeds of a plan in Hannah's mind. She began to identify the patterns. Masters who perished under mysterious circumstances almost always possessed a history of extreme brutality. Their ends were consistently attributed to natural failure. Hannah began to believe that a quiet network of house servants was administering a form of shadow justice. By 1840, Hannah had earned the status of the most reliable house servant on the Witmore lands. At 20, she was striking, brilliant, and utterly invisible to the white family she served. They conversed without filter in her presence, debating finance and politics, and exposing their prejudices, never suspecting she was cataloguing every syllable. She learned that Thomas Witmore was heavily indebted to Charleston banks and was contemplating the sale of several families to satisfy his creditors. She found that James was arranging a marriage to a Savannah heiress whose father controlled 3 major plantations, a merger that would solidify the Witmores among the elite of South Carolina. Most horrifyingly, she discovered their long-term vision for the enslaved population. During a gala in late 1840, she overheard Thomas boasting to his peers about his plan to breed his laborers like prize cattle to maximize his equity. "Selective breeding is the cornerstone," he proclaimed, his voice rising with arrogance. "Retain the strongest men, dispose of the weak, compel the women to mate with the finest specimens. In a decade I shall possess the most valuable human stock in the Carolinas." Hannah remained motionless in the entryway, a tray of soiled glassware in her grip. He was speaking of her companions, her blood, her community, as if they were mere livestock. She thought of Celia, now 45 and crippled by the arthritis born of years in the steam and cold. She thought of Moses, still carrying the physical ridges of his childhood beating. She thought of the young women in the quarters who would be subjected to Thomas Witmore's breeding program. That night, Hannah reached her conclusion. She would no longer wait for a distant liberty. She would not put her faith in a rescue that might never arrive. She would not simply pray for salvation. Instead, she would deliver justice personally, using the one instrument she possessed, her mastery of botany, her control over the food supply, and her status as an invisible observer. The following dawn, Hannah initiated her meticulous groundwork. She began harvesting oleander foliage, drying it with care, and milling it into a fine dust that bore a striking resemblance to black pepper. She validated her concoction on rodents, refining the concentration required to induce a death that mirrored heart failure. She scrutinized the Witmore breakfast ritual with renewed focus, noting the precise sugar levels in Thomas's coffee, the way Ella stirred her cup, and James's seasoning of his eggs. For 6 months, Hannah charted every variable. She refused to act on impulse. A single error would result not only in her own execution, but in the collective punishment of everyone on the estate. She had to be flawless, enduringly patient, and completely unnoticed until the moment of the strike. As the winter of 1847 transitioned into spring, Hannah felt the timing was right. The Witmores had grown increasingly tyrannical during the lean winter months, projecting their financial anxieties onto their laborers. 3 field hands had perished from exhaustion and lack of nutrition. 2 women had been sold off to cover debts, separated from their husbands and offspring. The final catalyst arrived when Thomas Witmore declared his plan to sell Moses to a sugar plantation in Louisiana. A virtual death sentence disguised as a transaction. On the night of March 14, 1847, Hannah lay awake in her cramped quarters behind the kitchen, listening to the nocturnal rhythms of the plantation. Tomorrow would be the transition. Tomorrow she would provide the morning meal for the final time. Tomorrow the Witmore family would settle their debt for 13 years of malice with their lives. As the first light touched Charleston harbor, Hannah stood and began the preparation of what would become the most notorious breakfast in South Carolina lore. The morning of March 15, 1847, began with the veneer of any other day. But Hannah Morrison understood it was the conclusion of her ordinary life. As she traversed the morning fog toward the kitchen structure, carrying a basket of fresh eggs, she heard the metallic sound that confirmed the Witmore's fate, the rattle of slave chains approaching on the lane. A trader's wagon was nearing the estate, pulled by 2 exhausted mules. Hannah recognized the driver immediately. Josiah Fletcher, a man with a reputation for purchasing laborers from failing estates and shipping them to the lethal sugar fields of Louisiana, where life expectancy averaged less than 7 years. Thomas Witmore stepped out from the main house, fully attired and clearly expecting Fletcher. Hannah slipped behind the kitchen walls and listened as the bargain was struck. "I can offer 800 for the boy," Fletcher remarked, discarding tobacco juice into the dust. "That Moses has the frame for it, and the sugar masters value strength. He won't endure for long, but they'll extract good labor before he breaks." 800 is acceptable," Witmore answered. "He has been a source of friction regardless. Perhaps Louisiana will instill some discipline in him." Hannah felt the earth shift. Moses, her brother who still carried the trauma of his youth, was being bartered into a grave, and Thomas Witmore discussed it as if he were trading a plough horse. "I'll collect him today," Fletcher added. "I have a vessel departing the harbor tomorrow morning. It's better to move them before they have time for farewells. It makes them more compliant." Crouched behind the kitchen, something within Hannah finally broke. All the years of methodical plotting, all the quiet endurance, it all focused into a single point of action. Fletcher would shackle Moses and remove him before her original timeline could unfold. She had to act now. But as she observed Fletcher inspecting her brother like a piece of merchandise, she realized this was no longer merely about saving Moses. This was about delivering a message that would resonate across every estate in the South. The domestic workers of the region had been whispering of a reckoning for years. Hannah would be the one to strike the match. She spent the remainder of the morning sharpening her plan. The Witmores always gathered for breakfast at 7 a.m. sharp. Thomas, Elena, and James were Slav to their own routines, which made them easy targets. Crucially, they dined in the formal room, away from the kitchen, granting Hannah several minutes of solitude between the serving and the consumption. But the chemistry had to be exact. Too much powder and the bitter taste would betray her. Too little and they might survive the attempt. Hannah had spent months calibrating the dosages based on their physical builds. Thomas, at 200 pounds, ate with vigor. Elena was smaller, perhaps 130 pounds, and a dainty eater. James was a robust 170 pounds and consumed his meals rapidly. Hannah retrieved her hidden jar of oleander dust from beneath the floorboards. It was so fine it could pass for pepper, and she had tested it on vermin to ensure it was both lethal and invisible. As she toiled, her mind went beyond the poison. She thought of the network. News of the Witmore tragedy would spread like a fever, and she wanted the invisible army to understand the true subtext. She had spent years forging these links. Sarah, at the Middleton place. Mary, the seamstress, who was learning to read in secret. Rebecca, who was chronicling every abuse she saw. These women were her sisters in arms. She had spent the previous night sending out the signal. Laborers moving between lands carried her coded message to domestic workers throughout the Low Country. The cook sends word that tomorrow's breakfast will be seasoned with care. She hopes the neighbors will preserve the recipe. Every servant in the region would decipher the meaning. Hannah was signaling the start of the conflict. As she plated the food, she reflected on the psychology of her masters. Their greatest weakness was their own arrogance. They trusted the very people they stepped upon. Thomas never questioned his coffee. Elena never doubted her tea. James never considered the woman who made his bed could also be the one to end his life. This trust was rooted in the racist delusion that enslaved people lacked the cognitive ability to orchestrate a complex strike. Hannah was about to dismantle that delusion forever. The psychological strike was as vital as the toxin. She had observed their reactions to stress. Thomas turned to rage. Elena turned to denial. James turned to his father. None of them were equipped to face a systematic dismantling of their lives. She also knew the law. South Carolina in 1847 would hang any enslaved person who took a white life. But she had seen enough natural deaths to know that house slaves could evade the noose if they were clever. Oleander mimicking a heart attack was her shield. In a world without modern forensic science, proving a crime was nearly impossible if the victim had a history of weakness. Thomas had his chest pains, Elena her nerves, and James his heavy drinking. Her ultimate goal was a spark. She wanted to ignite a revolution of the invisible. Her strike would appear to the white world as a freak accident or an isolated tragedy. But to the enslaved, it would be a declaration of total war. The dawn was grey and heavy on March 15th. Fog from the harbor muffled the sounds of the morning. Hannah rose with steady hands, donning her plain cotton dress and the blue head wrap that had been her mother's. There was no room for fear now, only the cold requirement of justice. At 5:30, she crossed the courtyard to the kitchen. The keys at her hip felt heavy, the keys to the pantry, the spice locks, and the fate of the house. She ignited the hearth, the orange light flickering against the walls. She hung the iron kettle to boil. From her secret place she pulled the oleander. She measured the doses with scientific care. 2 teaspoons for Thomas's coffee, 1 for Elena's tea, and 1.5 teaspoons for James's grits and eggs. The Witmore clock was her conductor. 7 for Thomas. 7:15 for his wife, 7:30 for the son. Hannah moved through the kitchen like a ghost in a ballet. She ground the beans, the scent filling the room with a false sense of normalcy. She sliced the bread. She cracked the eggs, their yolks glowing like a sun the Witmores would never see again. At 6:45, she heard Thomas's heavy boots in the hall. He prided himself on his early rising, claiming a planter's wealth was made before the sun. This morning, his punctuality was his doom. Hannah's pulse remained calm as she poured the boiling water, watching the dark coffee bloom. With a motion she had practiced 1,000 times, she added, "His sugar." Then, with the same effortless grace, she stirred in the 2 measures of oleander until it vanished. Next, she prepared the tea for the mistress. She chose the finest leaves, a luxury Elena demanded while her workers starved. Hannah measured the tea into the porcelain pot that had been a family heirloom. She added the honey from Savannah to mask any grit. Then, she stirred in the single measure of powder. As the mantel clock struck 7, the study door creaked open. Thomas was ready for his ritual. Hannah arranged the cup on the silver tray next to the Charleston Mercury, which carried debates on the expansion of the very system that was about to fail him. How poetic, she thought, that he would read of the future of slavery while consuming his own end. She carried the tray into the house with the same steady, unhurried pace she had used for years. Total normalcy was her greatest weapon. Thomas was at his mahogany desk, his hair slicked with pomade. "Good morning, Hannah," he remarked, not lifting his eyes from his ledger. "The sky is clearing. It should be a fine day for the cotton planting." "Indeed, master," Hannah answered, her voice a perfect mask of servitude. "A fine day indeed." Thomas lifted the cup and took a deep, satisfied swallow of the poisoned brew at exactly 7:03 a.m. Hannah watched from the corner of her eye as the first dose entered his system. The justice of the Ashley River was finally being served. "Yes, master," Hannah replied. Our voice showing absolutely nothing as she placed the coffee cup near his right elbow. Perfect weather indeed. Thomas lifted the cup and took his first swallow of the doctored coffee at exactly 7:03. Hannah watched from the corner of her eye as he drank a large amount, then set the cup down with a happy sigh. The oleander was already entering his blood, starting its silent work on his heart. Hannah went back to the kitchen to get Elena's breakfast ready. The mistress of the plantation liked to eat her morning meal in the sunroom that looked out over her rose garden. Elena acted like a fragile lady, even though she was 43 years old and as tough as iron when it came to hurting slaves. The tea service was a fancy habit she demanded, fine china, silver spoons and fresh flowers. Hannah set everything up perfectly, knowing Elena would look for any mistake. The poisoned tea sat in its pretty pot, looking just like every other pot Hannah had made over the years. At 7:15 sharp, Hannah knocked lightly on the door. Elena was sitting at her table in a yellow silk gown. "You are right on time, Hannah," she said, proud that she managed her house so well. "Pour the tea, and don't make it too strong. I feel a bit delicate today." Hannah poured the tea with a steady hand. The liquid looked golden and perfect. Elena added cream and stirred it with her silver spoon. "Perfect," she whispered at 7:18. "You make the best tea, Hannah. I don't know what I would do without you." Hannah bowed her head. "Thank you, Mum. Will you need anything else?" "No. Just tell James his food is ready. You know how angry he gets when he has to wait." Hannah went back to the kitchen for the last task. James Witmore was the youngest and the meanest. He was 24 and treated the slaves like objects for his violent games. He was the one who wanted to sell Moses to the sugar fields. James liked his eggs runny, his bacon very crunchy, and his grits with lots of butter. Hannah made it just right, then stirred the oleander powder into the grits and eggs. At 7:32, James walked in, looking messy from drinking the night before. He was already shouting, "Where is my food? I need to be in the fields to watch those lazy hands." Hannah set the plate down. James started eating fast, finishing the eggs in 4 bites. He washed it all down with milk. Hannah wanted him to taste every bit of his end. By 7:45, all 3 had eaten. Hannah started cleaning the dishes, her face calm as she waited. Within 20 minutes, the first signs appeared. She heard Thomas make a confused noise in his study. By 8:15, both parents were in the dining room. Thomas had chest pain, and Elena felt sick. "Must be the humidity," Thomas gasped, sweating. James tried to stand up but fell back down. "I feel strange," he slurred. I can't breathe." Hannah kept working in the kitchen, listening to their panic grow. Elenina realized something was very wrong. "Thomas, your face is grey," she whispered. The poison was hitting her faster because she was smaller. Thomas tried to stand and fell, clutching his arm. "Can't breathe," he choked out. James tried to yell for help, but it came out as a croak. By 8:30, their hearts were failing. The room was filled with the sound of gasping. Hannah appeared in the doorway looking worried. "Master, mistress, is everything okay?" Thomas could only point at the kitchen, but the poison was impossible to find. Elenina whispered, "Get help." The doctor. Hannah ran to the slave quarters, pretending to send for help. She knew no doctor could save them. There was no cure. When she came back, Thomas was passed out and James was shaking in his chair. Elenina was still awake, her eyes wide with terror. She looked at Hannah and for a second she knew. She realized the slave she trusted had killed them all, but she was too weak to say a word. Thomas died first at 8:57. James died 5 minutes later. Elenina lasted until 9:15. As the clock hit 9:30, Hannah stood alone with the bodies. The most powerful family in the area was gone. She felt no joy, just the quiet feeling that justice had arrived. Their deaths would send a message that would change the South. The silence was heavy. For 7 years, Hannah had lived with the sound of orders and whips. Now, it was quiet. She moved quickly to set her plan. She rang the plantation bell 3 times, the signal for an emergency. Then she acted like a scared servant. When the overseer, Jack K. Morrison, ran in, he found Hannah crying over the bodies. "Lord have mercy," Jack yelled. "What happened?" "I don't know, Master Jack," Hannah sobbed. "I served breakfast and went to the garden. When I came back, they were like this." Jack checked Thomas's pulse. "Must be his heart," he said. "He's been stressed about money." This was exactly what Hannah wanted him to think. "But what about the others?" a field hand asked. "Sometimes it runs in families," Jack said. "Or maybe bad food. Food poisoning can kill fast. Ride to town and get Dr. Morrison," Jack ordered. "Hannah, you stay here, don't let anyone in." Hannah was alone with the corpses. She used this time to scrub every dish. She washed the coffee pot and the teacups until they were perfectly clean. No one could find any proof. She also sent coded messages to her friends on other plantations. To Sarah, breakfast didn't agree with the family. "Something bad is going around." To Mary, "Lost the family. Hearts just gave out." These were signals that her revolution had started. Dr. Morrison arrived at 2. He checked the bodies and agreed. "It looks like heart failure. Thomas was sick, and the shock must have killed the others. I see no signs of poison." Hannah kept her grief-stricken face on. Because the doctor said it was natural, there would be no real investigation. News of the deaths spread fast. Neighbors came to Speckwalte, but no one blamed Hannah. However, the plantation had to be sold to pay debts. This meant Moses might still be sold. But Hannah had a plan for that too. She talked to Elizabeth Witmore, Thomas's sister, who didn't like slavery. "Miss Elizabeth," Hannah said humbly, "I'm scared for my family. My mother is old and my brother is weak. Please, could you buy us?" Elizabeth felt sorry for her. "I will talk to the lawyers," she said. "I can't buy everyone, but I will save your family." Elizabeth thought she was being a good Christian, but she was actually being brought into Hannah's circle of resistance. At the funeral, the minister called Thomas a kind man. Hannah just stood in the back, knowing the truth. In the following weeks, whispers spread. Other house slaves began to learn from Hannah. Sarah started testing plants. Mary taught others how to find poison in the woods. Fear began to grow in the white community. Masters started making slaves taste their food first. They realized they were no longer safe in their own homes. 3 years later, in 1850, more masters died suddenly. One in Virginia, one in Georgia, one in Alabama. The white people called it natural, but the slaves knew better. This fear helped lead to the Civil War. By 1860, Hannah was a legend. Her story was whispered in the cabins and turned into secret songs. When the war started, Hannah was 41. She used her network to give the Union Army secrets about the Confederate soldiers. When the war ended in 1865, Hannah walked out of the house as a free woman. She spent the rest of her life writing down stories of how slaves fought back. She died in 1889 at age 69. She was buried in a simple grave, but her legacy lived on. She proved that the most powerless people actually have the most power. That breakfast in 1847 wasn't just a meal, it was the start of a war that ended with 4 million people being free. Hannah Morrison, the cook no one noticed, had served justice. According to historical records from the 1800s, the enslaved population in South Carolina was huge. In 1840, there were roughly 327,000 enslaved people and 259,000 white people. This meant enslaved people made up about 55% of the total population. In the Low Country near Charleston, that number was often as high as 80% or 90% on specific plantations.